The Crusades were a battle between Christians and Muslims for control over lands in the Middle East that they both held sacred. They were a struggle between not only armies, but faiths. Are places ever worth fighting over?
Well, you have your church, which you would fight over to protect your religion.
My house.
Like historical places, probably definitely Mecca.
Jerusalem, because it's a really sacred place for a lot of religious people.
My grandparents' house in India, because it was named after their two kids who died.
America in general. I mean, it's where I live, you know.
May 18th, 1291. A conflict that has raged for 200 years finally nears an end. A massive Muslim assault breaks the walls of the last Christian stronghold in the Middle East. At a fortress near Jerusalem, desperate holdouts endure the final attack in a medieval holy war.
So the idea of the Crusades, the symbolism of the Crusades, became the clash of civilizations.
At a place called Acre, the dream of a Christian-controlled Holy Land is shattered.
The fall of Acre in 1291 was a key event because it marked the end, effectively, the end of the story of the Crusades in the Holy Land.
At last, from beneath the ruins, the evidence reveals how the warriors on both sides of the Crusades lived, fought, and died. For more than 2 centuries, Christian and Muslim armies are locked in a deadly struggle for control of the Holy Land. From 1096 to 1291, lands in the Middle East change hands in a series of 8 brutal wars. When the fighting finally ends, tens of thousands are dead. In the late 11th century, Muslim sultans rule most of North Africa, Spain, and the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. The Christian world is split. Europe is a collection of small states and kingdoms. To the east, the Byzantine Empire is controlled from its capital in Constantinople, what would later become Istanbul in Turkey.
The Crusades give us a model, they give us a template of the clash of religions and the clash of civilizations and the clash of continents.
In the Middle East, Acre is a lively Muslim city on the coast of what is modern-day Israel.
There's no denying that it was a major port and a major commercial center. Both commercial and military, those are the 2 points. You can't just look at it in a military sense.
Acre is also the gateway to a most sacred place. It is called the Holy Land. At its core is Jerusalem, a city sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But violence has plagued this region for centuries.
Many Muslims, particularly in the Middle East, see the creation and the manner of the creation of Israel as an extension of the Crusades themselves. That is, the arrival and the presence of Westerners.
Beginning almost 1,000 years ago, a series of wars transformed this center of faith into an unholy battlefield. Today, archaeologists probe the moment in time when the cycle of fighting began.
I'd say it was about 3 pounds there.
In England, scientists research the role of military technology.
The idea that the Western Europeans came in with some kind of superior military technology, and that's why the First Crusade was able to win, I think is complete baloney.
Historians piece together the personality clash between England's King Richard I, called Richard the Lionheart for his courage, and the Muslim hero, Saladin.
Saladin is a magnificent figure because of the generosity of his character and the generosity of his spirit.
Richard arrives as a brawling, drunken football hooligan And by the end of his tour to the Middle East, he's a changed man.
What forces drove these men? What motives sparked and fueled 2 centuries of war? Return to the year 1095. The Christian world is in turmoil. Islamic armies take control of the eastern end of the Byzantine Empire. And power struggles between rival knights wreak havoc in Europe. The Catholic Church is the sole source of unification. It's centralized and politically influential. The Church's leader, Pope Urban II, decides to take strong action.
Here was this Pope Urban II who looked across Europe and saw all this bloodshed going on between these knights, and they had all this warrior energy, and they were just fighting one another all the time. And in a kind of inspiration, he declared that he should harness all of this energy towards a noble quest.
Pope Urban declares that Christians must liberate the Holy Land from its Muslim rulers. In 1096, the first Crusaders prepare for their journey.
The First Crusade is kind of a hodgepodge. It's not a fancy military enterprise. A lot of people and a lot of common people become involved. It's a very popular movement.
From across Europe, tens of thousands join the quest, including hordes of peasants, all a bit unclear of their mission.
Those who set off had a rather hazy notion, most of them, of what they were doing.
The Crusaders did cause havoc. How were they to live? How were they to sustain themselves? It was almost like Sherman's march through the South. I mean, they had to live off the land, so they were not welcomed as they moved along.
As they head east, the peasant mob spins out of control. Lacking any real direction or leadership, a German mob of crusaders along the Rhine River massacre thousands of Jews. And 4,000 Hungarians are killed in one town alone. Before they can make it across Eastern Europe, most of the peasant crusaders have turned back or died of disease. The news of these massacres in Europe does not concern the Muslims in Jerusalem.
The great majority of people in the Islamic world, they simply regarded Western Europeans as a load of ignorant thugs, useless for anything, really. So much so that they had virtually no interest.
Christian military forces depart from Europe in 1096. After a 3-year march, they finally push into the Holy Land. May 1099. The first elements of the Crusader armies reach Jerusalem. Inside the city walls, the Muslim and Jewish defenders consider their options.
The Muslims are inside preparing for war. They're looking out, they're seeing all of these foreign troops are coming in to conquer the city. So what do? They boil oil, they sharpen their spears, they count their weapons.
In June 1099, the Crusaders surrounding Jerusalem halt. They may be fanatics, but they're not ignorant.
The Crusaders spend from June 6th to July 14th building and understanding how to attack the city. They send their architects around, trying to understand the weaknesses of the city itself.
The city's perimeters are impressive. Jerusalem is surrounded by fortified walls, but the Crusader engineers find a weak spot not in the walls, but in the landscape.
This is actually the spot where the Crusaders breached the walls of the old city. It was a spot that throughout history has been used because this is the flattest area in Jerusalem. In the northern part of the city right here, that's where Jerusalem can only be defeated.
July 7th, 1099, the battle for Jerusalem begins. Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders on the 8th day of the campaign. Christians overwhelmed the Jewish and Muslim defenders of Jerusalem. The Crusaders turned their siege into a massacre. Historians estimate that between 10,000 and 20,000 Muslims were killed. The Crusaders also burned a synagogue, killing many of Jerusalem's Jews who fled there for sanctuary.
Jerusalem is so associated with the massacre of Muslims and Jews in that military triumph that it is tainted in history.
It was seen as barbaric, uncalled for, and it created a great demand for revenge and retaliatory action.
In the following years, the Christians erect 45 churches, many built on the ruins of mosques and synagogues. They also built fortresses to defend them. The Holy Land in the year 1160. 60 years after the siege of Jerusalem, the Crusaders have established 4 states in the Holy Land that are protected by 60 strongholds.
Now, these castles are very strong, much bigger in many cases than the castles from the same period within Western Europe.
They build these fortresses on high ground so they can see for miles in all directions. Yet, despite their lofty vantage points, the Crusaders are blind to another threat. After Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders in 1099, a new leader unites the Muslim world 80 years later. His name is Saladin. While Crusaders weakly control the Holy Land, Saladin unifies the lands known today as Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and northern Iraq.
There is no modern political leader you can compare to Saladin.
Saladin is a 41-year-old warrior and sultan from what is now Iraq.
Here you have a man who was a convinced, pious Muslim, but he was also a realistic ruler. He was not a naive innocent. He was not a saint. By and large, there's no denying that Saladin he's a hero.
Saladin's secretary describes his leader.
Whenever the Sultan shook hands with someone, he would not let go his hand until that person had taken the initiative to do so. He was a paragon of chivalry, generous, extremely modest, and had a welcoming face.
But how comfortable was Saladin on the battlefield? Was he merciful or ruthless?
He was not a saint, or indeed he could show considerable ruthlessness.
Crusaders are hard at work building a castle at a strategic site, a site called Vadam Yaqub. Saladin attacks before the Europeans can finish their work. The Muslim army breaks into the castle, defended by about 1,500 men. The Crusaders are killed, their bodies dumped into a mass grave. Saladin's victory at Vadam Yaqub keeps the Christians from fighting for a while. The Crusaders and Muslims sign and break a series of peace treaties. When the Crusaders attack Muslims making their pilgrimage to Mecca, Saladin invokes an Islamic practice almost forgotten until then. He declares a jihad.
Jihad is a declaration of holy war, and it's a holy war for defensive purposes. Saladin declares a holy war, and that's what unites the Muslims.
What the Crusades succeeded in doing was reviving this aspect of jihad.
20,000 Crusaders learn this in 1187. When they confront the Muslim forces at a place called Hattin, they are trapped.
The trap which Saladin sprung on the Crusaders was brilliant. The Crusader fighters were coming from this direction, making their way down below to the fresh water badly needed in the Sea of Tiberias. When they got to this point, the trap was sprung. Saladin sent out thousands of archers from this cliff face and shot arrows down at the Crusader army.
Historians believe the mobility and accuracy of Saladin's archers were unparalleled. At the Battle of Hattin, Muslim archers give Saladin the advantage. The entire Crusader force is taken prisoner or killed. More traumatic is Saladin's capture of the holiest relic in Christianity, what Crusaders believe are pieces of the cross on which Jesus died. Christians call this relic the true cross.
When there would be a great military battle, the Crusaders stupidly would take out this great relic that they would have divine providence. And it was interesting the way in which it was used as a bargaining chip, because it was of no value to the Muslim side and of great religious value to the Christian side.
A defeated knight sums up the Crusaders' despair.
Lord God, our war is over. We are nothing but dead men, and the kingdom has come to an end.
Hattin is important because this is where Saladin establishes himself as a military genius. It is Hattin and the fall of Hattin that really opens up and turns round the Crusades.
After Saladin's decisive victory at Hattin, he takes back the port city of Acre. 3 months later, in 1188, the Muslims win the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. The news reaches Europe that Jerusalem and the true cross are lost. It was reported that the Pope died from the shock. Saladin enters Jerusalem in triumph, not in fury. He takes control of the holiest Christian shrine in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Instead of destroying the church, Saladin opens its doors to Christian pilgrims, many of them members of competing religious groups. To prevent one Christian faction from shutting out the other, Saladin places the keys of the church in the hands of 2 Muslim families. Their descendants remain the gatekeepers of the church to this day. Saladin's generosity fails to impress the European rulers, who declare another crusade with a new leader. This time, Saladin meets his match. June 7th, 1191. A 34-year-old English king sets foot in the Holy Land at the port city of Acre.
Richard the Lionheart was a war lover. He was the greatest warrior of his time, a great athlete.
Richard the Lionheart is not your typical English king. He has spent a total of 6 months in England, and his native language is French. But he also speaks the universal language, money. He promises the Crusaders gold for each stone they remove from the walls of Acre. Winning Acre will give Richard a beachhead in the Holy Land. But to retake the port, they'll have to breach defenses the Crusaders built when they ruled the city. June 11th, 1191. Pulling Acre apart brick by brick will take too long. To conquer the fort, Richard's army needs a shortcut. The solution? Portable attack platforms called siege towers. Rolled up to the enemy wall, the soldiers climb stairways to the top of Acre's walls. Saladin's secretary describes the psychological impact.
It overtopped the city wall. The city garrison were greatly fearful of it and were tempted to ask for terms.
July 12, 1191. Little more than a month after Richard's arrival, the city of Acre falls to the Crusaders. Richard soon grows impatient when Saladin is slow to negotiate the terms of surrender. The English king orders Muslim prisoners led out of the city. One by one, they're killed, 2,700 men in all.
And this is a great stain on Richard's reputation historically, and undercuts the kind of mythologizing and romanticizing of Richard in European lore.
Despite a long tradition of bloodshed, Richard finally tries diplomacy. At a military stalemate with Saladin, he sends an offer to his enemy.
Come here, and listen well to my words. The country is utterly ruined, and goods and lives have been sacrificed on both sides. The time has come to stop this.
Richard sends a wish list to Saladin. At the top is Jerusalem and the True Cross. Saladin's reply is swift and sharp.
The city is as holy to us as it is to you. It is therefore out of the question for us to abandon it. As for the cross, it is a great trump in our hands, and we will surrender it only in return for some important concession.
According to legend, the only concession Richard has to offer is his own flesh and blood.
I propose that my sister, Queen Joanna, marry Melek el-Adel, Saladin's brother. Once married, the couple would become the joint rulers of the new kingdom of Jerusalem, with their royal seat in Jerusalem.
But Richard's sister refuses. The deal is off. But both sides are talking instead of fighting.
There's an interesting relationship that develops between Richard and Saladin over the years that Richard is in the Middle East. Correspondence, exchanges of gifts, exchange of fruit, even exchanges of doctors when Richard falls ill. And this shows the kind of respect that both develop for each other.
When Richard falls sick with fever, Saladin's personal physician makes a house call. And brings fruit juice cooled with snow from a distant mountain. When help comes from an enemy, it brings with it a hope for peace.
When we arrive at an understanding, we will meet, and friendship will prevail between us.
Richard and Saladin never do meet in person, but on September 2nd, 1192, the two great warriors make peace. The terms? Acre stays a Christian stronghold. Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands, but Saladin guarantees safe passage for pilgrims of all faiths to the Holy City. And what happened to the True Cross? Along with the Holy Grail and the Lost Ark, it too is lost to history. After spending a year and a half in the Holy Land, Richard departs for Europe empty-handed.
Richard the Lionheart spent 5 years, mobilized all of Europe, bankrupted England to come to capture Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre. Got to the gates of Jerusalem and decided to give it all up. But I don't think he thought of himself as a failure.
The religious access to Jerusalem forged by Richard and Saladin outlives them both. But the winds of war will stir again 100 years after their deaths. Once again, crusaders come to the port of Acre. Summer 1290, a century after Saladin and Richard make peace, Acre remains the last major Christian foothold in the Holy Land. Here, Europeans trade goods and ideas freely with the Muslims. But the dialogue soon breaks down as Muslim and Christian leaders renew their power struggle. European kings enlist 12,000 newly recruited crusaders, mostly Italians, who arrive in the summer of 1290. They are supposed to help preserve the peace. Instead, they end it. By the end of August, Acre is shattered. The Crusaders go on a rampage. They consider anyone wearing a beard a Muslim, and they kill him on sight. News of the massacre soon reaches the rulers of the Holy Land, a collection of Muslim warriors from Egypt known as Mamelukes.
A Mamluk is a man who is of slave origin, purchased as a child or as an adolescent, and then is trained to a very, very high degree as a professional soldier, but he's also made literate. He's educated. He's not just a thug soldier. And when he's fully trained, he is released.
A Mameluke army gathers outside Acre's walls. Ultimately, some 200,000 warriors surround the city. The Mameluke strategy is described in this account.
He pitched his tents, set up 60 machines, and without any respite, assailed the city with fire, stones, and arrows.
Today, Acre's streets hold the evidence of that final assault.
These ballista are ancient cannonballs. The Mamelukes catapulted these things into the fortress itself, and they're found all over the place here.
Muslim catapults chip away at the fortress walls and the Crusaders' courage.
It's mostly the psychological impact of these things crashing in on a regular basis. It's a form of artillery bombardment. Where do you hide? There's nowhere to go. This thing could drop on your head any minute.
There is a saying in the Middle East, do not consider any act of kindness insignificant. But kindness in the final days of Acre takes a back seat to rank. Although the fort is surrounded by hostile forces, ancient accounts report some groups of Christians make a getaway. But how? 7 centuries later, after months of exhausting excavations, archaeologists discover the answer, a subterranean escape route for members only. Crusader knights take the tunnel out of Acre. This extraordinary exit stretches more than 1,000 feet from the fort to the Mediterranean Sea.
The tunnel connected the Templar castle in the west to the harbor in the east.
A military religious group called the Knights Templar built the tunnel. Members of this group are sworn to protect Christian pilgrims, but they also protect the secrecy of their exit strategy.
This is a private tunnel. No one knew except the Templars that there is such a tunnel. In the last day of Acre, the Templar Knights managed to escape through this tunnel to the harbor and then run away to Europe.
Never again are the Holy Lands occupied by the Crusaders.
The fall of Acre in 1291 was a key event. It was the end of the story. It was the last major enclave to fall.
In the end, Muslim culture is unaffected by the ways of the Europeans.
The impact on the Muslim world was minimum because here was a civilization already at a peak. And what they brought, the Europeans and the Crusaders brought to the Middle East, was simply ideas of war, and warriors, and sometimes brutal savagery.
Their dream in ruins, the Crusaders leave the Holy Land. But long before the Crusades began, Muslim ideas take root on the European continent.
What was positive for Europe was the idea of civilization, which means chivalry, which means learning, which means books, which means a way of life, which means cleanliness in personal hygiene and personal diet.
Scholars are stimulated by exposure to more advanced mathematics and astronomy. Italian merchants profit by ferrying pilgrims and trade goods to and from the Holy Land. New prosperity and trade stimulates cultural growth. The dialogue Saladin and Richard began 700 years earlier led to tolerance in the Holy Land. Today, many in the Middle East see that distant truce as a pilgrimage worth taking again. In the Holy Land streets where the Crusaders fought Muslims and Jews lies hope for everlasting peace.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following. What did people in the Middle East and Europe learn about each other during the Crusades?
If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.